famines, the spread of diseases, rising temperatures. Scientists all over the world do not hesitate to warn the world population about these manifestations of a phenomenon called climate change. To understand the issue of climate change, we have to go back in time. For thousands of years, mankind was able to live on this planet without harming or disturbing the ecological balance on a scale worth mentioning. It was nature itself that established the manner in which mankind lived, and so inevitably mankind had to submit to these rules. Of course, a farmer from the Middle Ages did cultivate his fields and cleared forests to have firewood, but all in all, you cannot say that nature or biodiversity as such were threatened, since it was always possible for them to fully recover. Although culture and civilization in general had been present ever since the very first appearance of the modern human, civilization now inevitably implies grave negative impacts on the environment. With the invention of the steam engine, the way was paved for technological inventions to contribute to a modern lifestyle in which not a moment's thought was given about environmental issues or possible limits which could stop the rapid growth of the economy. Our modern way of living and the world of today have nothing in common with the mentioned life of the farmer in the Middle Age, who lived in harmony with nature. Besides the fact that the world population has risen to more than 7 billion people, every human action inevitably makes a carbon footprint up on the earth, whether it is the turning on of light, catching a flight to the Mediterranean, or buying a t-shirt of your favorite clothing brand. This footprint can be measured with the emission of carbon dioxide, whose concentration in the atmosphere has risen rapidly over the past 5 decades and can now be seen as the main contributor to climate change. The Mauna Loa Institute on Hawaii has measured and recorded the concentration of carbon dioxide since 1958, which is expressed in parts per million. These records reveal a huge increase of the atmosphere's CO2 concentration, which has risen from 317 ppm in 1958 to 390 ppm in September 2013, and allow the conclusion that the modern lifestyle has an underestimated impact on the consistency of the atmosphere as well as our world climate. Carbon dioxide has become the currency of climate change, in which human action implies negative environmental impacts. The current and most prevailing political measure to combat climate change, as for example suggested in the Kyoto Protocol, aims at reducing greenhouse gas emission, especially of carbon dioxide. But in fact, the CO2 reduction is simply not happening, since fossil fuel emission is about 40% higher than it was in 1990. While recognizing this, politicians and scientists alike begin to seek for other measures to combat climate change and its manifestations. In this context, geoengineering is topic of controversial disputes. Can geoengineering be a solution to climate change? Our little presentation will try to find answers. The term geoengineering has already been used by Cesare Marchetti, an Italian physicist and system analyst, in 1977 to describe the idea of injecting CO2 into the ocean to reduce the atmospheric burden of this greenhouse gas. From then on, geoengineering has developed tremendously and has attracted the attention of scientists, politicians, and the public. There are two main approaches to geoengineering. The first would be carbon dioxide removal techniques, which remove CO2 from the atmosphere. They address the rising CO2 concentration, the root cause of climate change. The second one is solar radiation management, or SRM techniques, which reflect a small percentage of the sun's light and heat back into space.
A recent example that has already been put into force is the CCS project, the Carbon Capture and Storage Project. This technology is designed to prevent the carbon dioxide exhaust from the burning of oil and gas from entering the atmosphere and driving further climate change. It does this by either stripping the CO2 from the smokestacks of conventional power stations, or by burning the fuel in special ways so as to produce exhausts of pure CO2. The greenhouse gas then is buried underground, usually in exhausted oil and gas reservoirs. But how is the CO2 captured? The most common way is the post-combustion CCS. CO2 is absorbed from the exhausts of a power station by dissolving it in a liquid which later is stored in old mines. Solvents include chilled ammonia and amines, but researchers are still looking for more efficient solvents. One advantage of post-combustion is that it can be fitted to most of the existing power stations, which will generate much of the world's CO2 for decades to come. However, the concentration of CO2 is only about 15% from coal-fired power stations and only 4% from gas stations. In other words, the cleaning of these steams needs 25% of the plant's energy, and that can be expensive. This fact would also exclude older power plants, which already run at just 35% efficiency. One example of CCS is in Canada, at the Sask power plant, that is trying to start up with post-combustion in 2014. But what happens then to the CO2? Most projects get rejected because they are driving down the minerals of the already exhausted oil and gas reservoirs. But the last major geological storage option is in deep saline aquifers. For example, the Norway Sleipner project has stored millions of tons of CO2 a year from 1996 onwards. In fact, one Chinese CCS plant, for example, uses their CO2 for fizzy drinks. So, is it worth it? A lot of experts agree. Carbon capture and storage cuts the carbon emission to the atmosphere by about 20% by 2050, according to the International Energy Agency. Barack Obama even gave $3 billion in funding to research into CCS in the US, and Canada and Australia already have major CCS plants. However, Europe has no plants operating, but are currently planning more than 20. Interestingly, one obstacle to technological advancement is that people living near these CO2 storage sites are not willing to accept these projects in their backyards. The Netherlands, for example, has seen protests against the technology already. Another prime example of solar radiation management is the SPICE project. 70,000 years ago, the supervolcano of Lake Tabo in Sumatra erupted. The volcano ash rose comparatively very high into the atmosphere and lingered there over the continent. This caused nearly a new ice age on planet Earth, and many animals perished as a result. This event gave climate scientists food for thought. How can this happen, and how can we link it today to our climate change problem? So the SPICE project was born. SPICE stands for Stratospheric Particle Injection for Climate Engineering. Researchers at the universities of Bristol, Cambridge, Edinburgh and Oxford collaborated with Marshall Aerospace, a large aerospace and defense company, and the project aims are the investigation of the feasibility of one technique, the idea of simulating natural processes that release small particles into the stratosphere. These reflect just a few percent of total incoming solar radiation and would cool down the Earth at a manageable speed. So, how does it work? During the volcano eruption in Lake Tabo, the volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide was pushed into the stratosphere. And like with the volcano, these dioxides would absorb the stratospheric water vapor and an aerosol cloud would start to grow. This aerosol cloud would expand over time to cover the whole sky and would linger there for nearly 1 year. This would act like a shield to the solar radiation. The next problem, though, was to find an alternative for the volcano. How can we get the sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere? Some came up with the idea of planes, others came up with high towers. But in the end, they agreed on a special concept in which a balloon is fixed to the ground, spraying sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Sulfur would be burned and turned into sulfur dioxide and then liquefied on the ground. This liquid would be pumped up through a very long hose into the stratosphere and would spray a fine mist of colorless sulfur dioxide. This hose is fastened to a helium-filled balloon that would fly 25 to 100 feet above the ground. An advantage with this concept is that only one spray would take 10 days to cover the Earth, and a very little amount of sulfur dioxide would have a huge effect on the planet. But critics believe that the very long hose won't be able to stand the vast winds in the atmosphere. And what would happen if the hose were to break? But in 2012, researchers of the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg found out that this project would have a huge, huge impact on our climate on Earth. They calculated that there would be nearly 20% cut in the amount of rain on Earth. This would cause serious trouble to the agriculture, flora, and fauna on Earth. Another option of climate engineering is the ion fertilization of the ocean. Over the last 250 years, the ocean has absorbed more than 25% of all anthropogenic emissions. This is much less than its long-term uptake potential, which corresponds to an uptake fraction of approximately 80% of all emissions on a timescale of circa 500 years, and more than 95% on a timescale longer than 100,000 years. Given the potential of the ocean carbon sink and the lag with which this potential is being realized, it is not surprising that the idea of shortcutting the slow process of ocean uptake by injecting CO2 directly into the ocean emerged already in the late 1970s. Ion fertilization of the oceans may be a strategy for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. The idea is that it stimulates the growth of phytoplankton and therefore sequesters CO2 in the form of particulate organic carbon. But how effective is ion fertilization of the ocean really? Experiments over the past decade in several ocean locations consistently showed that intentional ion additions do result in phytoplankton blooms that help draw down carbon dioxide from the air. But the experiments have not determined how much carbon is transferred and sequestered in the deep sea rather than quickly recycled back into the atmosphere. It should be noted, however, that ion addition will only stimulate phytoplankton growth in about 30% of the oceans: the Southern Ocean, the Equatorial Pacific, and the Subarctic Pacific, where ion depletion prevails. Another important aspect of ion fertilization of the ocean we should take into consideration is the potential risks of this method. One risk of ion fertilization of the ocean may be increased production of methane and nitrous oxide, deoxygenation of intermediate waters. Another risk may be changes in phytoplankton community composition that may cause toxic blooms and or promote changes further along the food chain. Moreover, one has to consider that the actual carbon sequestered per unit ion and per dollar are overestimates. The cost of large-scale and long-term fertilization will also be offset by CO2 release and emission during the acquisition, transportation, and release of large volumes of iron in remote oceanic regions. To conclude, one can consider ion fertilization as a method which might be worth it to be taken into further consideration. However, it might take very long until this approach will be explored enough and will be practical.
Geoengineering is a solution to the problems of climate change by managing the environment around us in order to affect the climate in various ways. This has been hailed as a last-ditch answer to what some see as one of the greatest obstacles to continued human existence. But geoengineering may not be as perfect a solution as it seems. Climate change is an issue that requires world cooperation in order to achieve the goal of halting it, since it affects the whole world and not just one geographical area in particular. And if it comes so far that geoengineering is really the only option, it is of paramount importance that everyone does their bit to add to the project. Otherwise, you have a few countries doing all the hard work, investing in R&D, putting the technology into action, while the rest of the world simply waits it out and then profits from results. One of the biggest and most persistent arguments against geoengineering is a terribly simple and dangerously human one. Solar radiation management makes it possible not only to stop climate change, but also create it. SRM can therefore also be used to cool the Earth down in the case that we are too late in our actions taken against climate change, that temperatures do start posing a threat to life on Earth. But this feature, which may initially sound great, could be geoengineering's biggest drawback. In our current world of short-term democracies, the tendency is to plan for the short term too, in order not to lose votes. And so there will always be an incentive for countries to procrastinate and stop trying to reduce emissions today, because they have a way to save themselves from their own mistakes in the future. Fossil fuels are running out, yet still we are not putting in enough effort to find or invest in alternatives, because we are still dead set in the belief that someone will come up with a solution. But where's our hero now? What we really have to look at are the ethics of the whole situation. We are actively condoning the altering of not just our environment but our climate, a course of action that seems as if we just wanted to play, well, God. We got ourselves into this mess by altering the climate, and now we are considering attempting to do the same thing, albeit with a degree of control. But this control is really only a degree. For one, we cannot accurately measure the effects of these tools. The stream of scientific thought is still in its infancy. Simulators will be inaccurate in their predictions, and there's no way we can test this small scale. With SRM, we are looking at very, very long time lags, so if we make a mistake, we may not have the possibility to correct it until it's too late. We are playing with forces so large that the margin for error is slim. If scientists even slightly misjudge their calculations, as happens far too often, we could be aiding what we are trying to reverse. Fighting climate change with climate change is risky business. So are we really willing to put our survival on its knife's edge in the hands of a few engineers? But we are being faced with possible mass extinction, millions, billions of refugees. So can we seriously stand by and do nothing? If we created this mess, we should be trying our utmost to reverse this, even if this may require drastic measures, because with the way things are looking, drastic measures may be required. Geoengineering's moral issue is one that needs public exposure and debate, for it is looking to becoming more and more a genuine option for tackling climate change. But can we handle the responsibility, the possible side effects, the risk?
After all, what conclusions can one make about geoengineering? At the moment, just very few people argue to go ahead with it. That is because of diverse reasons, which we will explore later. But one thing is certain: humankind is able to influence global warming and the climate. But if we really go ahead with geoengineering, there is a consensus that we should start slowly and cautiously. The amounts of chemicals used must be low, and everything would need to be monitored so that it can easily be stopped at any moment. But, as we have said earlier, the majority of scientists and citizens do not believe that we should go ahead with geoengineering. And that is for good reasons. First of all, there's the legal problem. Is geoengineering allowed or forbidden? No one can tell really. One also has to ask, who could go ahead with it? Which politician? And which country? Maybe even which individual? And how would the international community react? There's no system with which possible conflicts could be resolved. Most cost estimates right now show that almost any country could afford to shoot sulfur into the air. This creates a problem of responsibility for the actions. Take this example. An industrialized nation, maybe the US, starts a geoengineering program which causes a drought in Asia or Africa. One cannot tell which negative side effects geoengineering might have. Potentially, those can be huge and dangerous. The SPICE project takes particles and chemicals to the sky with the help of huge pipes or balloons. But how do we really know they are not going to break? Let us consider the case of the Maldives, the first country to drown due to the sea level rise caused by global warming. What if they just went ahead with these measures unilaterally, as we have already seen that geoengineering would be affordable for almost any country? Who could stop them, and would you blame them? But let's face it, there's only one case in which you consider geoengineering with its danger of causing a catastrophe. That is, if the risks of not using it are actually higher. This means that the more catastrophic climate change becomes, the more likely we will resort to geoengineering. In a way, one can compare geoengineering to chemotherapy. No one really wants to put poisonous chemicals into their body, but this is what chemotherapy does, and people do it because they are really sick. At some point, geoengineering could be the last option we have. It could thus be defined as being a plan B, but a very bad plan B that we should seek to avoid, according to Professor Hunt of Cambridge University, who says that if we have to use these tools, it means something on this planet has gone seriously wrong. One should also recapitulate the risks of geoengineering. For example, a cooling of the planet will lead to changes to Asian monsoons, which billions of people need to drink and to grow their crops. Talking about apocalypse scenarios, David Keith, professor at Harvard University, says, "When you start to reflect light away from the planet, you can easily imagine a chain of events that would extinguish life on Earth. But the best and simplest solution to the problem of climate change remains to stop emitting so much CO2, especially through the reduction of fossil fuels. In a way, geoengineering can be used as an excuse by politicians who try to avoid the tough decisions necessary to save the planet and reduce greenhouse gas emissions." This is not to say that this path is easy in any way. In order to obtain clean energy, we would have to build a nuclear power plant every week for the next 50 years. Is that really what we want? In any case, the two largest greenhouse gas emitters, China and the US, need to step up their climate change efforts. China builds a new coal plant every week, and the Obama administration has so far produced not a single climate change legislation. That does not make one optimistic when looking into the future. But it is crucial that the international community comes up with solutions to the problem of climate change, so that we do not have to use our last resort one day, which is geoengineering.